Okay, we are recording. My name is Marcus Chatfield. I'm with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Today is March 1st, and I am here with Mr. Matt Weaver, and this is an interview for our Oak Hammock History Collection. So, Mr. Weaver, thank you so much for making time for this interview today. And I wonder if I could start with just where you were born and some of the early influences in your life that were important to you.
Sure, Marcus, and it's my pleasure to be with you. So I was born in Warren, Ohio in 1959. Went to elementary, middle school, and high school in Warren. I went to the College of Worcester for my undergraduate degree, majored in economics, and then went to the University of Michigan to get an MBA with a specialty in finance.
Wow, and what were some of your first work experiences with that degree?
So my first job was in Chicago. I worked for a financial advisory firm called Ponder and Company. We were the advisor to a state issuer of healthcare bonds. And so my career has, from that first job to today, has always been involved in the financing of capital projects, mostly not-for-profit. And not-for-profit corporations can access tax-exempt bond financings. And so I've been involved in that from the start. The first 2 years working and advising the Illinois Health Facilities Authority, we worked with mostly not-for-profit hospitals in raising capital for capital projects and refinancings. And at times there were some not-for-profit nursing homes or retirement communities that came in and worked with us as well. From there, I wanted to move to an investment banking firm that actually sold securities, not just advised on them, and had a couple of opportunities, one in New York and one in Jacksonville, Florida. So we got married, my wife and I got married, and we moved here in 1985. Again, to focus primarily on hospitals. And one of the guys that worked in the office had been the former president of Presbyterian Homes of Florida. And the firm that I worked for at the time, Underwood Newhouse, had hired him because they thought there was a good business in working with retirement communities, which Okemos is generically, and helping them, plan, if they're new, helping them plan their development, their construction. And as a result, I really took a liking to the retirement community side of the business. It was great to work with boards who were trying to help older people. It was a relatively new area. We did a lot of new construction financing. And so I really had to learn all about the basic operations of a retirement community and the development of a retirement community. We ended up splitting off and forming our own firm in 1990. It was called Force Financial. And a couple of years later, we decided to add a development consulting and a management consulting component to that. And I had again, my partner who I referenced earlier, he had the management experience and the development experience, and really learned from him on how all that comes together. So it was my privilege in 1997, the firm had specialized in financing not-for-profit organizations that had a sponsorship with a connection to their constituents. And we had financed 7 retired military retirement communities, Air Force, Army, Navy. They all wanted to have their own place. And of course, they had been accustomed to moving around the country and living on bases. So communal living was comfortable to them. We did these projects for officers, and their pensions were good pensions, and they had the monthly income to be able to afford an upper middle income retirement community. So the number of veterans and retired officers that were interested in doing that kind of leveled off after you get through the Korean War, and the number of folks in the military were trending down. So we got together and thought about what other constituent groups out there might be interested in developing and associated themselves with a retirement community. And we decided the universities would be a great way to go. As it turned out, we had consulted with a sociologist that worked in the gerontology department at the University of Florida, Dr. Stribe, and we called him up and said, hey, we've got an idea, and we'd love to work with a university that's got a great following and a great constituency. Jacksonville is only 70 miles from Gainesville, as you probably know. So we took a quick trip down and talked to him, and he provided the introduction to, at the time, the president of the University of Florida was Dr. John Lombardi. And that's how that conversation started. And again, I was fortunate to be in the middle of that. And eventually I was tagged by our firm. We went from Force Financial. We started a consulting firm called Force Services. And then we merged with a not-for-profit retirement community system out of Maryland called Asbury Methodist. And so we were Asbury Development and Management at the time that we met Dr. Lombardi. And so the story of Okemos really starts there. And that's how I became involved. And that was the name of the firm.
Well, that's so interesting. I had not heard about the military retirement communities before in these interviews. So that's really interesting. And when you reached out to Dr. Stribe, was it Dr. Stribe?
Right.
At UF?
Right.
Why did you reach out to him in particular?
Well, we needed to get an introduction to somebody in the senior levels of the university administration. And it would just made sense that because he understood retirement communities, he helped us do some research on aging studies to support the notion that living in a retirement community, provides the ability to live more independent the rest of your life and to take care of those healthcare needs as they come up, but still stay within a community to get the socialization. So there's a lot of research that suggests that those types of things allow people to live longer and more independent. So we knew he would be a proponent of that philosophy, and we hoped that he had contacts, in the senior administration area, and he did. We literally asked him, could he put us in touch with the president's office? And so if you want me to continue, I can, kind of how this rolls into this. So as it turns out, again, sometimes life, you're just in the right place at the right time. And as it turned out, there was a influential alumni. His name was Frank Duckworth. I wrote it down to make sure I wouldn't forget it. And Mr. Duckworth at the time was the general counsel of Pfizer. And he worked in DC, but stayed in touch with the University of Florida. I'm sure he has donated some money that got the attention of the foundation. And he had been trying to convince Dr. Lombardi to sponsor a retirement community such as Okemos. That just was a coincidence on the side. So Dr. Lombardi said, well, I'm hearing from a respected alumni that we should do this. And I'm hearing that you folks in Jacksonville have a good experience in working with sponsors that have a great relationship with their constituents. So let's take the beginning steps to research this to find out if it's an idea that makes sense for the University of Florida. So in the meantime, Frank Duckworth retired as general counsel, and he eventually came on the board. Dr. Lombardi created a small investigating task force. And initially he got the folks from Shands involved because this looks like it was healthcare, and what the closest thing that was on campus that looked like what this is. And I think you all know Hammock has independent living, assisted living, memory care, and skilled nursing. So he involved the hospital administration. One of their senior vice presidents was on this task force, and he also appointed Leslie Bram, who was the chief operating officer at the foundation, to be on the task force. And so Mr. Duckworth donated $300,000 of seed money, and we used that to do a market research report. And we decided to do some focus groups. We went around to, I think it was Jacksonville, Gainesville, Tampa, Orlando, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami. And the foundation people knew of influential, well-known alumni in those areas. So we asked those folks if we reserved a conference room at the Marriott Hotel in that town, would they sign invitations to their friends and fellow Gator alumni in the area to come in and listen to us put on a program.
Wow.
So we put the program on, and we said it was going to be developed and located in Gainesville. And the purpose was to bring alumni back to their college hometown. And we had this vague idea of wanting to create affiliations with the university. We can come back to that later, but that was another key component. So, and the response we got from those five meetings, and that it probably took 6 months to coordinate all that, was very positive. So that helped give the idea some momentum so we could take the next step. And then the next step was to incorporate the not-for-profit corporation. That early investigation, I think, happened around 1997.
Wow.
And so we were able to define the project and how it might work, and we needed a not-for-profit board to go forward. So the university put the idea up through at that time, there was a board of regents that oversaw the 11 universities in the state. And the question was, would the not-for-profit organization that was to be formed to be the owner and the sponsor of Okemos, would it be a part of the formal university umbrella? I think they called it a direct support organization at the time, or did it need to be separate and apart, arm's length from the university? And so the powers that be at the Board of Regents said, we don't think it should be under the formal umbrella of the university. I think they had liability concerns. And so they said, if you're going to do this, you need to have it outside arm's length from the university.
Wow. Well, there's two big questions that come up for me. One is about the relationship with the university, but I want to back up to the focus groups.
Sure.
With the focus groups, was the idea for the continuous care retirement community model, was that already fully developed? Or were you also seeking input for what people would want in a continuous care model? I'm interested where that idea came from and if it was fully developed in 1997.
So, good question. So the continuing care, CCRC, we can use the acronym if we want. That's the old acronym. But That model, because it involves an upfront entrance fee, almost like a prepaid premium for future health care, because that was the animal, it was regulated by the Office of Insurance Regulation. So there was a business model tested and operating in the state. There were about 70 CCRCs at the time. And in one of the military retirement communities that I referred to earlier is Fleet Landing out in Atlantic Beach by Jacksonville. And we brought the task force up to tour Fleet Landing because it was relatively new, and it had that constituency feel of retired officers that became members there. So it was a defined business concept that we brought to them, and how the independent, the memory care, the assisted living, and the skilled related to each other, and the resident contracts, quite frankly, it's quite complicated, and they had been through the test of time. The Office of Insurance Regulation had to approve the board, do background checks. They had to approve our firm to make sure we were good people and didn't have any negative, behavior in our background. So it was a fairly well-known business concept in terms of what would be involved. Now, the programming, that's a whole different matter in terms of how we were able to, have relationships with the colleges and units at the university. That was creative thinking by Leslie Bram and the board, knowing those deans and how we could kind of layer that in to make this a special, very unique offering, versus your run-of-the-mill CCRC in the state.
Okay, so the university relationship is really more of the innovation than the CCRC model. That was already existing, but the relationship with the university was the unique aspect I'm hearing. So financially, what were some of the challenges of working this out? It sounds so complicated to think of how the university fits and how the contracts with the residents would fit and the state requirements. What were some of the main challenges with all that?
So I'll weave in the answer to that question with another fact that I think was, you could give a lot of credit to this for why this project is as successful as it is today. So Dr. Lombardi said, after the research came in, we've talked about it and the pros and the cons and all that type of stuff, he said, okay, I'm going to endorse this concept, but here's what I want. I want a world-class facility, and I don't want to use the money of the University of Florida or the state of Florida. And that was really the grand goal and mission. And as there were thousands of decisions that had to be made in the development, the selection of the site, how all that worked out, and the relationships with the university. If we ever got stuck in the mud and just got so confused in the weeds of the details, the board and ourselves had to go back to that. That was the challenge. Can we develop a world-class organization and not use the money of the university? So that's how all that got started. So let me stop there. Where do you want to go now?
Well, what was your particular role in all of that?
So our firm had 4 different divisions of expertise, if you will. And because it was apparent to us that the university didn't want to put any capital or guarantees up, we knew that we had to adhere to a development criteria or credit criteria that we were confident that the eventual lenders would finance the project without liability or guarantees from the university. And quite frankly, that played to our strengths because we had come up with 20 different credit criteria in the early stages of our company And at the time we were financing these projects with letters of credit to use the credit rating of the bank. They were international banks who were willing to issue a guarantee, if you will, and you could get the rating of the bank assigned to the bonds. And we had developed this credit criteria, so we knew how to put together the project and to make sure the credit criteria would be acceptable to the 5 or 6 banks out there that we wanted to go to. So we had, my background was from the finance side, although I told you I had learned the development. Secondly, and a little bit about the operations. My other partners had expertise in those areas as well. And so, and eventually, so I was tagged to lead the firm in working with the university and the development consulting, the marketing consulting, and then I led the team in doing the financing for the project. And it was, again, my fortune. We had 3 or 4 projects then, and I got tagged, to work with the university, just good fortune. And so we had a development agreement to develop it. We worked with Bruce Delaney, who worked in the real estate department at the University of Florida Foundation. He was well aware of all the sites in the Gainesville area and helped us do a site search and, helped us negotiate the site that it's at. And that kind of got us started, because you have to have a site before you can really gear up. We worked with the board in hiring an architect and a contractor, and we worked with the board in developing the program on what services would be offered, how they would be paid for. If we had the College of Health Professions, working physical therapy or occupational therapy, as an example, what those contractual arrangements were going to be. Again, there were a ton of decisions and details to be factored in, but that's how all that started.
Wow. And so when you're going to a lender, one of these international banks or a lender for this type of facility, are they interested in the university relationship and the CCRC model? Are they interested in the content of the selling points, or are they just interested in the bottom line? Because what I'm thinking is, for residents, the selling point was the CCRC model and the university connection, and there's really consistent themes of why people wanted to live there. But I'm wondering, for financing, was there anything unique about the Okemos model as a financer when you're approaching lenders?
So the 4 or 5 banks that I referred to, and Bank Paribas was the agent bank for this one. So we ended up having almost 107,500,000 of senior bonds. Paribas' letter of credit secured the whole thing, and then they participated out exposure to 3 or 4 other banks. We had worked with those banks on these other military projects and some religious associations, good projects, and that credit criteria and how these projects work. These banks had been experienced with that, and they knew what those criteria was. Now, right at the top is a great sponsor with a well-known name. Well, you can't get better in the state of Florida than the University of Florida, right? So it had the credibility and it had the connections to the alumni. So those 20 criteria, there was a grade that was assigned to each one, and Hammock just got great grades on all those components. We hired the best architect, the best contractor, because everybody wanted to work for the university. Now, the lenders or the banks knew, it was a business deal. They wanted to lend their money to a project that had good market research. We had good pre-sales on the units. It had all this credibility that I've talked about. They came and they loved the site. And and the expectation was, even though the university wasn't going to directly put their credit worthiness on the line to guarantee all the bonds, that the university would help appoint board members who were knowledgeable in all of these matters, whether it was architecture or business or, the health professions, college. So eventually a board was formed, and there were, we did this on purpose. There were 11 members, and the university had 5 members. They wanted to have a minority position on the board, so there would be no liability tracking back to the university. Now, the president had to okay the president had to okay the 6 community members that weren't directly related to the university, but they were all well-known alumni, experienced in the fields that I mentioned. So that was a great system to make sure there were really good people on this board, and they were dedicated. They spent a ton of time in these meetings talking about all these things. And so the banks, the letter credit banks, they appreciated all that.
I'm sure. And so for you, was this kind of an easier project than typical? How did it compare with other projects that you've done with retirement communities?
This was, at the time, one of the, in the entire country, and to this day, there had never been a university affiliated CCRC that was done with the extent of the university affiliation. So quite frankly, this was the highlight of my business career.
Wow.
It was a great experience to work with great professionals, senior administrators at the University of Florida, and to get an inside look of the business of the University of Florida, the relationships of the colleges and their deans with the provost. And we went and talked to the colleges and the deans, and we tried to be creative in asking them, if you want to be associated with this group, how can we develop a program that you can interact with these residents? And the thoughts were, a lot of these residents were very successful, and they were going to come in, upper middle income or higher, and maybe at some point in time, they might consider a gift back to the university, which would run through the foundation and then probably to the college that they graduated from. So those connections were all there, and those were by intent, they were there. But that was kind of some of the background and how the sausage was made.
Yeah. And so the overwhelming story seems to be just how successful it was. And I want to talk about that. But first, were there any unique challenges?
Well, so this is, you'll appreciate this, and the listeners who listen to this later. So one of the biggest challenges that we had right off the bat, the best practice in developing retirement communities like this is, how do you set the fees, right? And you're going to take in individuals that are over, I think 62 or 60 was the minimum, but the average age around the country was 79. And you were going to, maybe 60% of those would be couples, and a lesser or not would be singles. And you were going to provide these services, and part of the upfront fee, again, was going to give you access to assisted living and nursing care at a discount. And you didn't know how long folks were going to live. So there's an actuarial science that is incorporated into the development and the pricing of these projects. Well, the president wanted a world-class community. And the world-class community is going to cost more than a middle-of-the-road community. Well, one of the rules of thumb that people followed was, generally, your average upfront entrance fee is equal to the average home value of the market that you're selling to. At the time, if you looked at the average home values in Gainesville, they might have been $150,000. But if you took it what it cost to build the world-class community, which was the challenge. It was more than that, but by a substantial amount, because in fact, we weren't only selling to retired faculty in Gainesville, we were selling to successful alumni in Tampa, Orlando, Jacksonville, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami. And those housing markets, you know, were higher at the time. So there was a dilemma. I can remember having this conversation with Leslie Bramman at one point in time, because the background in the industry was that was a no-no to really get, you know, to have a $300,000 average entrance fee, but to have an average home value in Gainesville of 150. So we struggled with the pros and cons of going at it this way. And Leslie Bram at one point in time reminded me, Matt, we're all working for the president here, and he said world class. So we're not going to let you bring the cost of this down to the middle of the road home value, because we're going to bring in other folks whose home values may be 3 times that amount.
Right.
So there was good debate, constant debate, intense debate about a lot of those matters, because all the programming, how big were the assisted living rooms, you know, all that, how many pools we were going to have. There's 2 pools there. Don't see that often, you know. How were we going to make this work from a financing perspective? And this is an interesting story that you get a kick out. So you've got all that going on. I'm getting in front of you a little bit now. We identified the market. We made collateral brochures and advertising material. We did a lot of direct mailing. We did these, we'd send the marketing teams into the cities every 6 months to do another presentation to catch the people that hadn't done there. The marketing of these is expensive, and it took probably about a year and a half to sell all the units. So we're doing great on that. I think we had to sell at the time 65% of the independent living units needed to have a 10% deposit. That was, again, a standard best practice in the financing industry. Right. And at that point in time, the banks were willing to offer this letter of credit. We could close the financing, put the money in a bank trustee, and then the contractor and the architects, they would get in and start building this thing, which I think the construction period on this was almost close to 24 months. It was a long build because it's a big project.
Right.
So this thing all got planned in 99. And during that year and a half, 9/11 happened.
Right.
And, you know, that shook the country up in a big way. And it definitely put a shockwave of anxiety through the senior marketplace where we were marketing to. You know, we just weren't quite sure what was going to happen after that. I'm sure home values dropped and people were just worried. And it wasn't a great time to be trying to sell a high class retirement community with that kind of an entrance fee.
Right.
So now we're in 2001, and we're trying to bring in the banks to do this. And initially, the financing community was shaken so bad by 9/11. Instead of there being, you know, maybe 6 or 7 banks we could have gone to, we might have shrunk down to 4. And we weren't quite sure we were going to be able to do the senior debt all with the letter of credit. The average cost of that capital was less than 3.5%. So it was a great structure. Whereas if we had to do non-credit enhanced bonds, the rate might have been 8%.
Right.
And so we really struggled with that. And then it took a little bit more time. And then finally, we got with Parabon, and we talked them into taking a little bit more exposure. And we finally were able to come back and finance 85% of it with the letter of credit. So then the other challenge, which we didn't envision at the beginning, was Parabon wanted 15% equity, if you will. Like buying a house, you got to put down a deposit equity. And we created that by selling $15.5 million of subordinate tax exempt bonds. So we had to do private placements, and we targeted the University of Florida board, we targeted the Okemos board, and we targeted the residents. And so, and they came in and filled out subscriptions. The minimum amount was $100,000. So that went well. That went better than I expected. And a lot of people would say, well, is the university going to back this up if it fails financially? And I had to say no. But then they'd say, well, how can you convince me that the university is really going to pay attention to this? And I'd say this, well, here's the deal. We've got this $15.5 million of subordinated bonds that all these individuals who are connected with the university have purchased. At the time, Chuck Young was the president. John Lombardi had moved on, and Charles Young was he was in an interim president coming from UCLA. And he and his wife purchased subordinated bonds. Marshall Kreiser at the time was chairman of the not-for-profit board of the University of Florida. His wife, Paula, was on the board. They bought subordinated bonds, and other board members and residents bought the bonds. So now you're telling the banker from New York, there is no formal obligation to back this financially, but listen to the folks that are buying subordinated bonds on this project.
Right.
But here was the thing that put it over the top. You get a kick out of this. So we had to bring the banks in and give them a tour and to meet all the people. And it happened to be the winter. And there was a basketball game. So Leslie, I think the Gators played Georgia, one Tuesday night in January. And so Leslie got us the foundation seats, which were behind the backboard, 5 rows from the floor. And you've probably been to the games. They're very exciting. And that crowd gets all jazzed up. And so that banker from Bank Paribas had never been to a basketball game like that before.
Wow.
And like 5 years later, he moved on, but he told me, I want to tell you this, that experience at the basketball game tied all the selling and promotion and, in the weeds detail, it tied it together where I just got it. I just said, wow, the relationship with this university and their alumni and everything, it just all of a sudden it clicked for him.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
Wow. That is such a great story. That's amazing. Yeah, I can see how giving him that experience and him seeing it firsthand really would make an impression.
Right.
So, from the beginning, I've wondered, you mentioned, trying to figure out how it's going to cost. And there's a calculation, I don't remember what you called it. Were you accurate? Were your predictions for what it would cost in the first few years, did it work out that way, or were there adjustments that you had to make? It seems impossible to figure out with all the care and all the staff and all the medical considerations. It just seems impossible to predict that. So how close were your predictions?
So starting off, the cost of the development, interesting enough, present day, this will shock you, present day, UCF did a project like this 5 years ago. They spent somewhere $14 million in risk capital up front to secure the site, to come up with the concepts that we've talked about this, and then to market the project, right? John Lombardi said no university money. Our initial budget, I think, was $5 million. This was another, I'm glad you brought, this was another one of those, we all called them go, no go points, that you bring the project up to a point, you look around and say, is everything working out like we thought it would be? Do we take the next step? Because you never commit, to spend $135 million from day one.
Right.
So there was an alumni from Jacksonville, I won't say his name, who had sold his company. And he was friendly with the foundation and Leslie went to him when the sale of the news came out in the public and said, look, you've been a great donor to the university. You've just had a great event. You just sold your company. We need somebody to guarantee a $5 million loan. Our initial calculation was it would be $5 million. Remember, UCF spent 14 5 years ago. We came up with 5 because we thought it would market faster and all those types of things. And so he agreed to guarantee the loan. Again, it wasn't the university's money. It was a friendly alumni's money. So we're still abiding by the wishes of Dr. Lombardi. It took another $1 million beyond the 5 to get the architectural design done and get the pre-sales to the 65%. And he was willing to put up a little bit more collateral or to sign another note to guarantee the extra $1 million. So that was one instance where we were able to make an adjustment along the way, but still stay true to the ultimate mission.
Yeah.
Now with regards, so the financial projections are interesting. You have these capital costs, architectural, construction, land, blah, 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 blah. Well, you know what those are because you're under contract for them, right?
Right.
And then you make an estimate on. There's an actuarial firm. They have great actuarial studies. We went to him, and for instance, he told us that the average 79-year-old male is going to live 18 years. 15 years he'll be in independent living, and then 3 years in healthcare. And so we map all this out, and when we know what the operating cost should be to care for him when he's in independent living with his spouse, if she's still around, and we know what it's going to be in assisted living, memory care, and skilled nursing for those last 3 years. So the question is, there were 264, independent living units when we started. Would all those residents, would those statistics play out for them? If so, then the pricing that we assume, the upfront fees and the monthly fees, won't have to be increased more than the cost of operating inflation, which is how it works.
Okay.
So we weren't very far off. What happened was, because of the affiliation with the university, the average entry age instead of 79 was 74. And we had substantially more couples than typically you would have, because the couples got very excited about the experience. And instead of waiting until age 79, so a lot of people will think about downsizing when they're their late 60s or 70s. And some people might downsize and then move into a retirement community. I think we caught some of the members of the residents at that point in time. They were skipping that downsizing to a condo. That they decided they were ready to move into Okemos because it was their condo in their home college town with those affiliations.
Yeah.
But that 74 year lower age has an actuarial impact, because those folks have that promise for that discounted health care for their entire life. So along the way, every year monthly rate increases came up, or every other year, they would update the actuarial study and plug in the actual demographics of the residents. So to make sure that the business model was going to continue and be successful. The actuarial folks, they calculate a financial stability and funding ratio just like a life insurance company does. And that was one of the guiding posts. And that was all part of one of the 20 credit criteria that we put in place at the beginning, because you have to make sure this thing works right.
Right.
And the Office of Insurance Regulations, going to want to make sure it's working right too along the way.
Right. A lot of stakeholders and interested parties in making sure it's successful, I guess.
Correct.
Wow, that is so interesting to hear all that background. A lot of it's over my head, I think, but I get the gist of it enough to know that it's really a remarkable success. So that's one of the things you mentioned. It was the highlight of your career, and it's remarkably successful. So could you talk a little bit about what that means to you, and maybe any lessons from Okemos that have been beneficial in your career since?
Yeah, it was fun and gratifying. I would say that half of the original board of directors ended up moving in, and they, there were the retired dean of the nursing school, and there were Bob Bryant was a provost, and great personalities, all have their own expertise, and being a part of all that and trying to figure out these decisions when people are coming from different perspectives was very interesting. Learning how to work with a large organization like the University of Florida and their decision-making process and what's important to them was really eye-opening to me. Neither negative or positive. It's just the world. You wouldn't get a glimpse into that perspective unless you had a chance to do what I did. And because we started working with those folks in 97, 98, and our company, managed that until I left the company in 2010. So meeting the people, prior to building and developing it, and then seeing them move in, and then to this day, when I run into somebody on the board or someone, there's still some of the folks in management that I know down there. I'll ask, what happened to so and so? Are they okay? They're still around. Some of them have passed on, and some of them are still there. So just the way we interacted with them, it was only 70 miles away. I was probably down there 2-3 times a month, every month for at least 4 or 5 years. Right. Go down to board meetings when my company was the management company, that type of thing.
Right.
So.
Right. Wow. Well, this has been a great interview. Is there anything else, any important points that we didn't cover?
So this is one that's a head scratcher. I'll tell you this because Okemos has been a big success from a variety of different perspectives. It definitely satisfied the goal of wanting to help the foundation raise money from the residents. I mean, I don't know what the current number is, but I guarantee you there's no other similar life plan community, CCRC, in the country that has had the donations that has come from the members, as we call them, as opposed to residents, to Okemos. So it's been a phenomenal success from that perspective, which was one of the main goals when Dr. Lombardi said, "Let's go."
Yeah.
So we actually thought that what a great experience to be a part of. We should be able to go around and sign up other universities, to do this and be very successful just doing that. And we had a very hard time. The risk to reputation and focus that Dr. Lombardi took when he said, "Let's go." Many universities just, we got the idea going, we got the president thinking about it, but then he'd get backlash from the faculty that we don't want you spending time and university resources on this item that's not even a part of the university. Give us a raise or develop a new research center. We ended up getting 4 or 5 other contracts out of it. And then when the Great Recession hit in 2008, most of those just went away. Right. So unfortunately, we weren't able to replicate this concept like we thought we could have. And I love to go back to have some of those conversations with those folks now and just tell them financially, because, at the president's level, universities have to raise money, right?
Right.
mean, that was not a well-known secret about Okemos, but from that perspective, it was wonderfully successful. And it brought all these great experienced people back to town when just because you're 75 or 79 doesn't mean you can't, relate to a high school kid who might be serving in the dining room or nurses in training who could help at the nursing home. Hammock has all neat programs for people to mentorship programs and all that. And I think it was just a great addition to the UF community. And unfortunately, other groups out there just never really appreciated that enough to want to do it on their own.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it seems so obvious that there's a dynamic relationship that it's mutually beneficial for UF and Okemos. And it is surprising that the model just wasn't instantly successful with, all universities.
Right.
And do you think that's because there was you mentioned the faculty support maybe was less enthusiastic elsewhere. Do you think they misunderstood the premise of, no university money? Do they think that did they just misunderstand or?
Well, there was another thing that I learned from that. And if you look at the statistics, the average tenure of a president of a major university at a Division I school with a big sports program is probably only about 5 years. So what we found was you approach the university when that president's been there 4 or 5 years and they're looking for another job, they don't want to take this on.
Right.
Or you catch them when they've been there the first 60 days and they've walked into some problems that they've got to fix before they could even think about doing something like this.
Right.
And you go back to them 3 years later and now they're on year 4 or 5 and they're looking to move somewhere else. So to some degree, John Lombardi was a unique personality and was willing to make that decision and take that risk. And even, he left in the middle of it. So
right.
I think the nature of the university president's jobs and the tenure there had an impact on this. And no one had the long-term view. Let's go ahead and invest in this. And they had Bob Frank was a dean of the College of Health and Human Performance, and he spent a lot of time on this too. And I guess we just had a very unique group of people who really wanted to see it work. And at the time, were in the place where they could allocate the time to make that happen.
That is so interesting. So it's the serendipity of the doctor, one of the professors approaching Dr. Lombardi, and then the financial interest, and that was a serendipitous, but then also the fact of where he was at in his tenure. And it's so interesting to think of how those things happen to come together.
And Frank Duckworth being there, talking into his ear on the side, which none of us knew about, and willing to put up the first 300,000 because they wouldn't have the money just to do the investigative work. And, it takes research and time to come up with those early facts.
Right.
Yeah.
That is so fascinating. That's so fascinating. Wow. There's so much new. I have not heard about the focus groups, or there's so much I learned in this interview. So again, is there any other important points that we didn't cover?
Oh, I'm sure there are, but we've been at it here almost an hour. So I'm sure whoever decides they want to listen to this has probably heard us talk enough.
Well, it's been great. And I really appreciate your time. And I'll go ahead and push stop here and we'll end the interview.